Well, we finally have a new budget GPU with AMD's 6500 XT. You might be tempted to buy one, but let's talk about why you shouldn't. Budget GPUs. An idea almost as worthless as the concept of MSRP, and this card's MSRP falls in at 200 USD. While we all know that's just a fantasy, it's not the only problem, and it might not even be the worst one. First, the 3500 XT only has 4 gigs of memory, which is a step back from its predecessor, and people keep saying that AMD's done this to make it undesirable to miners, probably because of this quote from Radeon VP Laura Smith. We have really optimized this one to be gaming first at that target market, and you can see that with the way we've configured the part. Even with the 4 gigs of frame buffer. That's a really nice frame buffer size for the majority of AAA games. I'm sorry, that's just really hard to say with a straight face. But it's not particularly attractive if you're doing blockchain type activities or mining activities. Literally, everything in that quote was wrong. That sounds like a bunch of BS because a 4 gig VRAM buffer isn't a really nice size for the majority of AAA games. And AMD even agreed with that back in June of 2021. No, this just sounds like turd polish marketing to me. And you can easily hit that VRAM limit in games from 5 years ago, let alone new games. In 2022, 4 gigs isn't a great proposition for gamers, especially in AAA titles, and it's going to require more and more compromises just to land on mediocre performance, if that. And I'll show you why in a minute, and why it's even worse for this particular card. And hold up, I know what you're gonna say. But if it had more than 4 gigs, all the miners would buy them, and then they wouldn't be affordable. Doesn't matter, because they're still not affordable, but we'll get into that a little later. And while she's right, Ethereum miners won't be interested in these because the DAG file is too big, she acts like there aren't other cryptocurrencies and that you can't mine any of them with a 4 gig GPU. Spoiler alert, there are. And I have a hard time believing she's not aware of that. Just look at the prices of any somewhat recent 4 gig GPU. So if you think that by itself is going to stop miners from buying them, think again. 4, 6, 8, or more. Doesn't matter, someone can use it for mining something right now and make money with it. But maybe that won't be an issue, but it still stands that having 4 gigs doesn't mean it can't or won't be mined with. Our second issue is that while those 4 gigabytes are GDDR6, it only has a 64-bit bus to work with. Once again, this is a step back from the previous model, and you should be noticing a trend here. At least this will probably make it a poor choice for mining. This is a far more compelling theory than the previous one. Miners definitely need those calculations to be done as quickly as possible. And regardless of the brute force clock speeds and the infinity cache, I don't think any of that's going to really help mining performance much. I'd expect it to perform about half as well as a 6600 in mining. As for gaming, none of that had the benefits that I hoped that it would. And it's really not great at that either. So perhaps this has made it bad for mining, but it's also contributed to making it a poor gaming GPU as well. Third, and probably the worst thing about this card, it's limited to 4 PCI Gen 4 lanes. But it'll just use 8 lanes if you put in a Gen 3 board, right? Right? Sadly, no. As you can see, this card is only wired for 4 lanes. Doesn't matter if it's in a Gen 4 board or a Gen 3 board. And this is another step back since the 5500 XT was wired for 8 Gen 4 lanes. But what's the big deal? This should be enough for this level of GPU anyways. Well, sort of, but the answer is a bit more complicated than that, so let's look at some testing to see why it's a problem. But first, let's squash the idea that this is bad for mining, because it's not. If you've ever paid attention to a mining rig, they opt for boards with a crap ton of 1x slots. And they just use adapters that go to a full 16x slot. That's because mining calculations need to happen quickly. But it's not moving a ton of data around, so that wouldn't be an issue at all for mining. Now, I'm not important enough to get sent a 6500 XT, but that's okay. I'd actually prefer nobody send me one. Instead, I'll be using the best 4 gig cards I have, an EVGA GTX 1650, the GDDR5 model, and an Asus Strix RX 470 4 gig. But if you want to see how this impacts the 6500 XT, definitely check out Hardware Unboxed review. Spoiler alert? It's not good. But I think the results here are still worth looking at. So I think I'm going to break this up into 3 groups. I don't know, I guess the mediocre, the not offensive, and the ugly. And looking at our first group of the mediocre, we have Call of Duty Cold War on competitive settings. And on both cards, the impact is pretty marginal, though the 1650 managed a bit better than the 470 with a reduction that was barely outside the margin of error. In Far Cry 5 on Ultra with the HD texture pack disabled, my how the turntables. This time the 1650 is handling the limitation worse with an 11% to 18% reduction to performance, where the 470 is unchanged. In our second group with Rainbow Six Siege on high, we see something similar with the 1650 having about a 10% reduction in performance, where the 470 is basically unchanged, though you wouldn't notice the difference in either case. And the story is much the same in Battlefront on Ultra, with results on both cards barely making it outside the margin of error. Moving on to the not offensive category, and things get a little more interesting with Forza Horizon 4 on high, both cards are hovering around a 20% drop in performance, though the 470 did a little worse on the 0.1% lows. In Battlefield 5 on high, it's not much different with both cards managing around a 10% drop, but the 470 took a 24% hit to the 0.1% lows. As we step into our first group of the ugly, things are, well, just that. In Forza Horizon 4 on Ultra, the 1650 is looking at around a 20% reduction, but the 0.1% really takes a hit at 36%. The 470 deals a lot worse with the situation with close to a 30% reduction across the board. In Rise of the Tomb Raider on high, it gets worse. The 1650 dropped about 25% on the average, 53% on the 1%, and 29% on the 0.1%, though its performance with the 16 lanes was pretty bad to begin with. However, the 470 was a lot more playable in both cases, with around a 20% reduction. In the second group in Battlefield 5 on Ultra, the 1650 was quite playable in either case with close to a 10% reduction overall, but the 470 simply crapped the bed with a 48% drop on the average, a 55% drop on the 1%, and a 41% drop on the 0.1%. In Doom Eternal on high, both cards didn't fare well as they were both hovering around a 50% reduction to performance overall, with the 470 dropping a bit worse on the 0.1% by about 60%. Okay, so what's going on here? Is the 4X slot actually bottlenecking the GPU? Well, no, not the core itself anyways. At no point did I see utilization drop on either card. This is the VRAM being bottlenecked because the closer you get to the VRAM limit, the more the GPU has to rely on system memory as an overflow. And while your GPU's VRAM is much faster than system memory, even DDR3 800 is faster than a Gen 3 4X slot by 2.4 gigabytes per second. So if the GPU needs to reach out to system memory, the bottleneck could potentially be the PCI Express bus. And please tell me you're not still running DDR3 800. Now, the results aren't all that different from what Hardware Unboxed was saying with the 6500 XT, but what's so interesting about these results is that they're so inconsistent between the two cards. You'd almost expect that the same test would yield the same reduction to performance, or at least be similar, and sometimes that was the case, in others they were completely different. So there are probably a lot of variables that impact if and how much of a problem this will be from card to card. And what's even more interesting is that even when the GPU wasn't even close to the VRAM limit, sometimes there was a real performance impact and sometimes there wasn't, which suggests that the VRAM can be using the system memory at any time. But the fact is, it gets a whole lot worse the closer you get to that limit, which is why I feel this is the worst corner they cut with the 6500 XT, especially when most of the people buying this card will be putting it in a Gen 3 board. And sadly, looking at the reviews, this was even an issue with the 6500 when it was placed in a Gen 4 slot. And fourth, no H.264 or H.265 encode support and no AV1 decode support. And again, it's kind of another step back from the 3500 XT, but it doesn't have AV1 decode support either. And you might think this isn't a big deal, as if streaming with this card makes zero sense. But it very well could for someone who wants to start out live streaming on a very tight budget and they don't have the CPU horsepower to do it. Also, they're useful for so much more than just streaming. Though the bigger issue to me is that it doesn't have any AV1 decode support. Everyone is going to migrate to AV1 for streaming video eventually. YouTube, Twitch, any streaming services you consume video content from, and even Facebook and TikTok will probably use it. This just limits its usability and limits its usefulness outside of its life as a gaming GPU. And the fact that Nvidia is offering the 3050 with all of these features, the 6500 XT looks like less and less of a value. Which brings us to the fifth reason, price. And I'm surprised. Newegg had a couple of models at actual MSRP, but one already jumped up and I expect the other one to do so before it comes back into stock. So we all know that the $200 MSRP is a very unfunny joke. Unfortunately, AMD didn't release a reference model, so if you want to buy one, you're at the mercy of AIBs, distributors, and scalpers. And yes, they're being scalped on eBay. Worse yet, people are paying for them. And honestly, I just don't know who this card is for. It's not worth the $200 MSRP, let alone $160 or more, especially when you consider the competition. I don't think it's going to be good for mining, and not because it only has 4 gigs of VRAM. And if you've watched reviews, you know that it's not a good gaming card either. It's honestly so bad that I'm surprised Gamers Nexus didn't honor it with their Waste of Sand award. It certainly deserves it when it's pretty much worse in every way than the 4 gig cards of the previous 2 models it's meant to replace. Hell, sometimes it was sitting down there with the 574 gig. And this BS that it was designed for gamers is just that. And I feel like AMD took a laptop GPU that's barely adequate to earn one the title of a gaming laptop, slapped it on a PCB and is selling it as a desktop GPU. That would explain the limitations a lot more than they were just trying to make it unattractive to miners. Maybe because that's exactly what they did. Not only that, it's worse than the previous 2 models where the 3050 might be nipping at the heels of a 1070, and as far as I can tell won't suffer from a single one of my complaints, well, except for price. And while its MSRP won't be any less of a joke, unless EVGA takes a much different stance than they have been, you should be able to grab an EVGA 3050 from Micro Center, the Newegg Shuffle, or the EVGA Q for close to that $250 MSRP, even well after it launches. And to me, that's going to be a much better value. I'd say go for the 3050 when it launches on the 27th of January, or look at used cards like the 584 gig, 1650 Super, or the 980 Ti, etc. Under no circumstances can I suggest you buy the 6500 XT if you're still on a Gen 3 board. And if you're on a Gen 4 board, there are much better options for similar money. I really want AMD to do for the GPU market what it's done for the CPU market, but this isn't it. It's been a big leap from Vega to RDNA 2, but this is just like 2 steps forward and a step back. And with Intel coming into the market, I don't think this card is a good move for AMD, and I honestly don't know how they saw this going any differently. So either shoot for the 3050 or wait to see if AMD turns out an 8 gig version that's de-gimped. So what are you gonna do? Ignore the reviews and get one anyway? Grab a 3050 instead? Or forget this plebeian BS, you've already got 2 3090s and SLI and this is all some peasant joke you're too rich to understand. Sound off down in the comments, and while you're at it, do all the other YouTube crap, and I'll see you in the next video.